Hi, my name is Nathaniel Fossen. If you're new to the channel, I'm an archaeologist. I mostly focus on the eastern woodland region of the United States, but I've worked everywhere from Alaska to Orkney Island in Scotland. And today, a few things are different for the channel. First off, I'm outside. I'm not hanging out in my hotel room. Getting to enjoy smoke and a beer while I record this. And second, this week I'm participating in kind of a community archaeology educator content drop called Real Archaeology. You can find a link to the website down below. And basically the concept here is that there's a lot of us online kind of independently making archaeological education content. And we're all kind of aware of each other's work, but we want to make a real effort to, build this as a community of educators rather than a bunch of random people doing these things on our own. So what we're doing is this weekend, we're all making pieces of regular content and putting them on the internet together to help people who are watching one or two of us find the rest of us. So that's what Real Archaeology is about. Now, today for my piece of work, I'm going to be resuming with the multi-part series I've been doing on the William Spring site. William Spring is a middle woodland period village off the Tennessee River in northern Alabama. And it's a site that I worked on when I was really early in my career. I was maybe 2 or 3 years out of undergrad, and I was a block supervisor on it. I was part of the report writing team. I helped do some of the lithic analysis. So I really personally had my hands in the archaeology of this site and in the research of this site. And this particular episode that I'm doing today is focusing exclusively on the zooarchaeology from William Spring, what we learned from the animal bones that were recovered. When we recovered these remains, and we realized how much we had and how important this was going to be to the analysis of this village, I worked with my company to collaborate with my mentor from undergrad, a man named Dr. Thomas White. He taught most of my archaeology classes at Appalachian State in Boone, North Carolina, and I have very vivid memories of packing up all of this material from our lab, putting them into the company vehicle, and driving them up to Boone for Tom to do the analysis, and then sitting down with Tom and looking at what we had and just kind of discussing what kind of research questions that we could ask using this massive assemblage of material coming from this village. Now, if you have no previous exposure to zooarchaeology, that's fine. I'm going to speed run the basics here in a minute. But I have several other videos on the channel that go over in more detail what zooarchaeology is, the techniques and methods that we use, and so on. This is my personal research focus. It's what I got my master's degree in at University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And so I cover a lot of zooarchaeology on this channel. Not exclusively, but I do cover a lot of it. Just to lay kind of the groundwork for some of the techniques that Tom used to conduct this analysis, there's kind of a really basic set of information that we have to record about each specimen, each individual fragment of bone. So you've got obviously things like metric data, like length and width and weight and things like that, but also what is the element, right? Is it a femur fragment? Is it a humerus fragment? Is it a rib, something like that? Is it part of the cranium? And is it a tooth? You've also got what side of the animal does it come from, or is it axial? Is it a right femur or a left femur? Things like that. Also, you need to know what portion of the bone was it, right? So like if we're talking about a radius or an ulna, was it the proximal, the medial, or the distal portion of that bone? We also want to know, are there any modifications? Are there cut marks? Is there burning? Is there acidic etching from the bone being digested at some point? is there any indication of rodent or carnivore gnawing? These kinds of modifications to the bone that have happened at some point around the time of the butchery, or the death of the animal, as it were. And then, of course, also, most obviously, what animal does it belong to? Sometimes you can say a lot about all of the other categories, but you can't actually pin down what specific animal taxon it comes from. If it was a deer or a turtle or turkey or something like that. Sometimes the element is not non-specific enough, or there are too many similar species in the region that it could belong to. There's a wide range of identifiability with each of these specimens, and what's identifiable and what aspects are not. Now, to make these identifications, Tom had to rely not only on his more 25 plus years of experience at that point, he also has a massive comparative collection, which is effectively a library of animal bones sorted by animal taxon. So you've got, your raccoon and your raccoons and your possums and your gray foxes and your red foxes and your dogs and deer and turkeys and all of these other things. And of course, also reference collections, manuals, and things like that to help make these identifications. Now, in terms of zooarchaeological theory, there are 4 fundamental biases that we have to be aware of before we start getting into a full-blown analysis. So one thing we have to realize is that there's a deposition bias. Not all of the animal bones associated with an animal that was utilized by people ends up on the archaeological site that we're excavating. So, for instance, if someone's fishing a lot, they might not bring the whole fish back. They might behead the fish, throw the head bones away, and only bring the rest of it back. Or they might fillet the whole fish, leave the bones behind, and bring the highest quality fish meat back with them, and leave the scraps. The same is true for lots of other bigger animal taxa. So you might not want to carry an entire deer back to the homestead after successfully hunting one. You might only want a certain series of cuts of meat and particular bones and things like that, and throw other things away. Let the scavengers have them. There can also be certain ritual, ceremonial, or traditional methods of deposition or discard that mean that those animal bones are not going to show up on your site. So, for instance, John Lawson, back, I believe it was in the 1700s, it might have been the 1600s, talks about in coastal North Carolina, there is a really rigid practice of burning hunted animal remains, anything you don't use, and burning them down. Because it's thought that if this practice, which is a sign of respect for the game animals, if this is not observed, the game animals will abandon the territory and they won't have anything to hunt anymore. I'm aware of similar practices going on like the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska, where I worked a few years ago, among the Kenaiti. So that's just the deposition bias. Not everything that got used ends up on the archaeological site that we excavate. So after the deposition bias, there's also preservation biases. And these are things like big bones preserve better than small bones. So a lot of times your deer bones are going to survive the ravages of time much better than squirrel or rabbit. They're just smaller, and there's more time for soil acidity. Or not more time, but there's more ability for soil acidity to degrade those bones to the point where they either no longer exist or are not identifiable anymore. And that gets us also to the last 2 biases, which are more back end. There's recovery bias. Not everything that we try to excavate makes it. Some of these bones are in such poor condition that we might be able to get good photographs and sketches of them and things like that. But if we try to take them out of the ground, they fall apart before we're able to get them back to the lab. So they can't be recovered. There's also common practice in archaeological excavation is we sift everything through a 1/4-inch mesh screen. And there are many bone elements that are smaller than that and will fall through the screen, especially for things like birds and fish and things like this. So there are a lot of contexts where we're recovering as much as we can, but it's physically and pragmatically impossible to recover everything. So our recovery biases are going to color what that final analyst is able to say about these assemblages. And then that final bias is the identification bias. Some elements and some specimens and some taxa are just easier to identify than others. Things like gar teeth, kind of fish, they have these very, very easily identified features. And they're very like marble-like, and it's easy to tell what they are. Whereas your average like mid-bone fragment, something from the center of the femur, if it's 1 inch long fragment, it's going to be very hard to actually identify what animal that is and what element that is and things like that. If you've got someone with a lot of experience and a lot of understanding of when they can make that call and can't, then sometimes you can get those mid-shaft fragments identified. Especially things like tibias are really easy to pick out. The ulna, no, not the ulna, the radius has very particular morphologies in a lot of animals that it's easy to identify what particular bone that is. And others are much more difficult to identify. A lot of ribs are very difficult to say much of anything about other than it's a rib fragment from such and such size animal. The faunal assemblage for William Spring was massive, over 147,000 specimens. Tom had 5 goals for the analysis of this mound of bones. Quote, "The goals of this analysis are to 1. Generalize about the taxonomic composition of the meat diet of the site residents. 2. Determine when, seasonally, where, and by what means various faunal resources were obtained. 3. Reconstruct animal food processing and disposal behaviors. 4. Identify any ritual, technological, ornamental, or other cultural behaviors manifested by archaeofaunal evidence. And 5. Compare the results of this study to those of other comparable sites in the Middle Tennessee River drainage area." I'm going to go through each taxonomic class individually, because it's very easy for the minority taxa to get buried under all the deer and turkey bones. Crustacea were represented by the burned legs and claws of crawdads. Because the exoskeleton deteriorates quickly unless it's been burned, this taxon is probably underrepresented in this assemblage. Gastropods were also identified, including at least 9 species of terrestrial snail, 13 species of freshwater snails, and at least 1 species of marine snail. More than 27,000 minimally identifiable snail specimens were counted, and another 5,991 grams of tiny unidentified fragments were also recovered. The terrestrial snails were represented with the full range of age groups. Tom gives the examples of Angospera and Neohelix species, which were found in features containing lots of mussel shell as well. If people were collecting these snails for food, they would tend to pick up only the biggest ones, because the juveniles are tiny and hard to see, and would really be a waste of time to collect. Because we have the full life cycle of these snails represented, it's strong evidence that these were intrusive to the feature, and not cultural at all. However, some specific features, such as 112, contained 101 fully adult Neohelix shells. This is an abnormally high concentration of this genus and can't happen naturally. They could have been eaten raw, but we suspect that they were boiled to make a sort of broth. Freshwater snails were collected in mass, and we recovered nearly 25,000 specimens. Some features contained thousands of these conical shells, especially from the Plerocera genus, and they tended to be all around the same size, so it's apparent that these were deliberately collected. After doing this analysis, Tom had his experimental archaeology class try a few different methods of collecting these snails, like using nets. But one of the students told me that the most effective method was just to wade into the creek and pick them by hand. This is the kind of task that children could reasonably be sent to do, maybe with an older cousin or a grandparent. The genus Marginella was identified based on a single shell bead. This is a taxon that lives in saltwater, meaning that this was a trade item coming up from the coast, probably from the Gulf, although the Atlantic coast is also possible. More than 6,000 fish specimens were identified, with 25 species represented. These were usually in features associated with other bone or shell, which improves preservation. Freshwater drum teeth and the robust cranial elements of the bowfin outnumber most other fish elements, and this is due to a preservation bias in favor of these robust elements. There's a similar bias in favor of the ganoid scales of the gar, which represent over 75% of all gar remains. Both the bowfin and gar prefer vegetated, slow-moving water, so they were probably caught in the wetland between the creek and the river. The drum teeth are very round, very durable, very identifiable. These were generally found in low numbers, but in a lot of features it's also probably the case that these things were rolling around at the surface for a while and then getting swept into features while the features were still open. This is the only fish species that most likely came from the Tennessee River itself, rather than the wetland or the creek near the village. American eel was identified based on 2 specimens. These are no longer found this far up the river due to extensive dam construction. These eels spawn in the ocean and then come upriver. Features 193 and 635 contain specimens from the genus Essox, which Tom suggests might be a pickerel. These also prefer vegetated, slow water like the nearby wetland. The handful of minnows identified were likely collected with nets from the creek. 6 species of suckerfish from the redhorse genus, Moxostoma, were identified. These would be some of the biggest fish found in the creek. The extinct hairlip sucker was also identified in a few features. Catfish were also common, and several species of bullheads and catfish proper were identified, as well as various species of bass and sunfish. Amphibians are often overlooked for reasons of preservation, recovery, and identification bias. I have a whole video about this subject that I'll link below. At Williams Spring, Tom identified 90 amphibian specimens, including frogs as well as hellbender salamanders. Half of the salamander bones were burned, compared to less than 5% of the other amphibian remains. They were probably eaten based on the high frequency of moderate burning. The elements recovered represent no less than 6 individual animals. The frog remains were more diverse, including bullfrogs and tree frogs, as well as almost 20 spadefoot toad specimens representing at least 8 individuals. 1,180 bird bone specimens were identified, and as usual the wild turkey was the best represented taxon, with at least 45 individuals represented. Turkeys are huge and they move in groups, so from the perspective of optimal foraging theory, they're very highly ranked animals. I'll drop a couple of links to my videos that cover optimal foraging theory and human behavioral ecology down in the description. Turkeys also lay eggs that were collected for food, and these were also found on site. 2 turkey tarsometatarsi, a bone of the foot, had been fashioned into pointed tools, probably for leather working. After turkeys, the next best represented taxon was the bobwhite, which is a small quail game bird. Most of the rest of the birds were represented by less than 5 specimens. These included 3 duck specimens, 3 hawk bones, 2 owls, including 1 screech owl bone, and a couple of extinct passenger pigeon specimens. The hawks and owls are less likely to be food. These birds are especially significant spiritual animals in southeastern belief. Most of these elements are wing portions also. The passenger pigeons are probably also underrepresented. Historically, they were mostly rendered for oil, which accelerates the degradation process of the bones. In zooarchaeology, mammals tend to be our meat and potatoes. The taxonomic diversity tends to be highest in this class, and at this site more than 8,500 specimens could only be identified as mammalian with no further size classification. And about 80% of these were burned, which accelerates the fragmentation process. There were also almost 1,000 specimens that could be assigned to small, medium, or large mammal class. Most of these were large. Tom's size classes are more broad than the ones that I tend to use, where his small is anything under a raccoon and his large is anything dog and up. I would put raccoons in the small 0.5 category and the squirrels into the very small 0 category, and then dogs would go in medium 1 with the beavers, and then deer would go into medium 2 with bears and wolves and mountain lions, and then elk go into large size 3 and bison go into large size 4. These are all based on the size of the bones, not the size of the animal. We all have our own systems for organizing minimally identifiable mammals. A lot of those smallest taxa are most likely to be intrusive, like shrews, moles, mice, voles, and rats. So we have counts on them, but they probably don't actually mean anything archaeologically unless we find them with cut marks or very particular burning patterns. Also, a lot of these taxa are represented in very low numbers, like possums, bears, otters, weasels, skunks, red foxes, bobcats, and elks. The only black bear specimen was a claw, which probably had nothing to do with food. The taxa that are really well represented are the raccoons, domestic dogs, squirrels, rabbits, and of course, white-tailed deer. Squirrels are the second most frequent mammal, with 2/3 belonging to the gray squirrels and the other third belonging to the fox squirrel, for at least the ones that were identifiable. Gray squirrels prefer more dense forest compared to fox squirrels, which makes them one of the many proxies for local environmental reconstruction. I've discussed this in some other videos, but squirrels have a very low return rate in terms of calories per hour of work to hunt, clean, and cook them. They are, however, relatively safe for children to practice hunting on and can be taken with blowguns, which are also relatively safe for kids. Rabbits kind of fall into a similar category. The eastern cottontail isn't that much bigger than a squirrel, but the swamp rabbit is about double that size. These can be trapped or hunted with throwing sticks. The sinew is supposedly a preferred material for fixing blades to spear shafts or handles. It's kind of this interesting intermediary game animal. Now, dogs are a very special circumstance. I excavated one of the very few dogs, in fact, what might be the only identified dog burial that was ever identified on Redstone Arsenal. And I'm not going to show pictures of that because in a lot of southeastern indigenous communities, dogs have a they're very sensitive material, especially for groups like the Muskogee and things like that. So we want to treat them almost like we would treat human burials. And I know that I have a certain number of indigenous viewers, and I want to make sure that those viewers feel safe watching my channel without being blindsided by something that they don't feel like they should see. So these kinds of things are published in the site reports and things like that. So if you really want to find them, you can, but I want to be careful not to, put things like that out on the internet on something like YouTube. But I can talk a little bit about how we handled that burial. When we first identified what it was and that it was a dog, I started with the wood tools, kind of trying to carve the clay out from around the bones because it was in really poor condition. And I was finding that the clay was stronger than the bone in a lot of cases. It just wasn't working. So what we decided to do was instead to leave a pedestal around the dog and dig all the dirt out from around it. Then we used a couple of shovels to pick up the entire pedestal and put that on in a box and sent that up to the lab. And Tom used some, water submersion methods and things to get the clays to dissolve off of the bone so he could find some elements that were actually identifiable. And of course, we also, took sketches and things like that of that particular burial. Now, when Tom did the analysis, he also found that he thinks that there are some other dog burials that weren't really identifiable as such in various features because they weren't in good articulation with each other. They had kind of fallen apart before we ever got to them, and they were very incomplete. One of these examples is there was an instance where a feature had both perinatal, which means that they're either still in utero or have recently been born, perinatal dog bones. And there are also some adult dog bones in that mix. So it looks like a pregnant dog had died and was in one way or another buried in this feature. But the thing is, the only one that seems to have been treated as an actual burial, as like a consecrated, like we dug a hole and we put this animal in the hole as a complete entity and then buried that individual with reverence, was this particular dog that I'm talking about that we lifted as a column or as a pedestal. We also got a disarticulated, which means it's no longer attached to any of the rest of the body. We got a disarticulated dog vertebra that had a deformed spinous process, and the deformation is this kind of compression where this spine that sticks off the back of the vertebra is bent down, and that's coming from weight and pressure being consistently applied to that bone while the dog is growing. And this is a strong indication that these animals are being used as pack animals. Remember, indigenous people don't have horses or donkeys or camels or anything like that. The dog is really the only domesticated animal that they've got that can carry material for them. So this is not particularly surprising, and I think it's a more important aspect of the dog's role in indigenous society than most people, even most archaeologists, are really aware of. As is almost always the case in the eastern woodlands, white-tailed deer represents the most consistent foundation of the meat diet here. 662 specimens were identified to the species Otocoileus virginianus. If we assume that the same deer won't have one femur show up in one feature and the other femur show up in a different feature, this accounts for a bit over 80 individual animals. However, this isn't necessarily a reasonable expectation. Deer are big animals that get broken up and butchered down. So if we calculate the minimum number of individuals across the entire site, it's more like 10 deer total. It's not just about food, though. Antlers are necessary for making the kinds of chipped stone tools we talked about in the first video. The bones are big enough to be worked into effective tools, but small enough to reduce the labor needed to make those tools. Elements of the feet, including tarsals, carpals, and phalanges, appear in large numbers, but this is proportional to the body of the animal. You've got about 100 feet bones in any given deer, and only, I think, 14 leg bones. A deer has a lot more foot bones than it does leg bones. An abnormal pattern at William Spring is that the toe bones have regularly been broken open deliberately, probably for marrow extraction. This is a desperate behavior because there's far more marrow and bone nutrients in the other bones of the deer's body. That means they're breaking up everything to get at all of the food they can out of these bone elements that really have a whole lot more labor involved with them than actual reward. The metapodials were treated a bit differently from the rest of the feet. These are long, robust, and very dense. They're ideal for making various bone tools, especially pins and needles. The long midsection portions of the metapodials, called the diaphysis, represented some of the largest bone fragments we recovered. So the upper limbs, like the femur and humerus and tibia, were being smashed open for marrow, and then further pulverized to be boiled for grease and collagen. I talk about this process in my first Zooarch videos. The toes were also smashed open for the same reasons, but the long metapodial bones were broken into bigger strips and not crushed further, meaning that they were habitually saving these to make tools, especially pins, needles, awls, and other long-pointed tools. I have to make a side note here, because the upper limb bones are less identifiable when crushed up than the foot elements, and the foot elements were less extensively crushed in the first place. It looks like a lot of those upper limbs are missing, even though they're obviously in that assemblage of about 600 unidentifiable large mammal bones. That's the identification bias in action. Even though we're confident that these deer did represent food and not just a source of hides, sinews, antler, and other tool resources, there's very few cut marks on these bones, which is also fairly common. I most often find them on the distal ends of the tibia, above the ankle, where the hide is detached from the foot. Tom found only 2 instances of that, as well as one on the heel bone itself, the calcaneus, one on the sternum, 2 on the ribs, and a handful of other cut marks. The extreme fragmentation of these bones probably also contributed to the erasure of clear butchery marks. Post-capture processing can have a strong effect on what we recover. That's the deposition bias at play. The average deer is small enough that after it's been field dressed, 2 people can carry the whole animal back to camp. Bigger animals aren't like that. Bears and elk have a lot more meat and they're a lot heavier, so it's not unusual for these animals to be more extensively butchered and only the highest quality cuts taken back to camp, with any unwanted bones left behind. This process can actually account for why we find so few elk and bear remains at the village, even though there's sparse evidence that they were eaten. It's also possible that larger mussels were gathered from the Tennessee River, but they were shucked and the shells left behind rather than being transported back to the village. There's a similar issue with small animals like birds, small fish, and amphibians. If people were eating them whole, bones and all, they're unlikely to show up on site. And that's kind of leading me to segue into covering taphonomy. Taphonomic processes are events that happen that alter or erase material from archaeological sites after they've been created. Things like soil acidity, scavenging, digestion, gnawing. Surprisingly, only 10 specimens showed the characteristic signs of rodent gnawing, and these were spread across several different features. Carnivore gnawing was much more common, with 47 specimens showing more shallow, indented teeth marks. 56 specimens show acidic degradation that shows that they had been digested, probably also by dogs. In both cases, most were of large mammals like deer, but some of the digested specimens were also from fishes, snakes, turtles, and birds. The fact that these gnawed and digested bones show up in pit features tells us that people at the village were cleaning up trash, including dog shit, and dumping it into these open pits after the pits were done being used for cooking or food storage or whatever. Burning is usually the result of human activity, but it has taphonomic consequences. Half of all the specimens recovered from William Spring were burned, and burned bone preserves better than unburned bone. Some are only charred, which produces a black or brown color, sometimes with a kind of purplish undertone, while others were calcined, leaving them white. About a third of all the features that contained animal bone only contained calcined bone, which almost always breaks down into small, often unidentifiable pieces. Unless you're lucky and you get a very particular piece with an articular surface or another diagnostic feature. By contrast, the crawfish were only identifiable when they were burned. You can see that in this chart. Burning on snail shells was rare, and that's probably because the cooking method was more likely boiling for broth, so no exposure to flame. Mussel shell tends to fall apart when it's been burned, so that affects the recovery rate. Even for vertebrates, which are better preserved when burned, they don't tend to get that way from cooking, though. Only small exposed bone ends get burned at all during the roasting process, and the bone that's covered with flesh remains unburned. And none of that will be calcined. Calcification happens when bones are left directly in fire for a long time, burning out all of the organic material, all of the collagen. So it's more of a waste disposal indicator than anything else. This disposal can also be a prescribed ceremonial practice. Tom White cites John Lawson's report from 1709, where he describes how indigenous groups in the Carolina Piedmont ritually burned all the bones from their food because they believed that failing to do so would drive game animals away from their territory. He doesn't really say if the idea is that the cremation is how they show respect for the animals, or if it releases some kind of vital force that improves animal procreation, or what the rationale is. But for sure, the only appropriate method for them to dispose of animal bones was to burn them, and that has archaeological consequences. When we start trying to talk about the diet that these animal bones represent, we have to be really careful for a series of biasing reasons and also for various cultural reasons. I've read several papers and studies where they try to use the identified animal remains and sometimes MNI calculations to make estimates of the amount of meat that these animals represented and what animal provided what percentage meat to the diet and so on and so forth. And I find this practice to be completely bogus for a lot of reasons, but I think Tom articulates it more succinctly than I can on page 175.
These arithmetic acrobatics usually are misleading in that they are all based upon assumptions that the identified remains are representative of the recovered remains, that the recovered remains are representative of the deposited remains, and that the deposited remains are representative of the animals gotten, and that all animals represented in the assemblage were food. These assumptions are almost never warranted, especially when dealing with faunal remains in secondary deposits such as backfilled pits.
These methods also fail to account for the likelihood that some animals were processed for marrow and bone grease that was used for food and others were not. I know some zooarchs swear by biomass calculations, but I'm just not buying it as a viable method, especially not for indigenous groups who weren't raising livestock. Even so, we can see that deer contributed a lot to the diet at William Spring, as did wild turkey, raccoons, squirrels, and rabbits. They're also well represented. These smaller animals, being more likely to be consumed and discarded whole rather than portioned out and spread across the site, are less likely to show up scattered in different features. So we can more reasonably calculate the MNI for each feature separately and then add them all up. With that method, we're looking at about 80 squirrels, 39 raccoons, and 26 rabbits. Our MNI on turkeys is 45, and that's the only bird with more than 10 identified bone specimens. So it's almost certainly the most important game bird. Box turtles and turtles from the family Kinosternidae are the most abundant, but the box turtles are reportedly unsafe to eat if they consume too many poisonous mushrooms. It taints the meat. I've yet to find a reputable source on that claim though, so if anyone has one for me, drop it in the comments. Snake bones were fairly abundant, but each snake has a lot of bones and not a ton of meat on them, so relying on number of specimens is especially deceptive. Frogs and toads might represent food or natural intrusion, but the hellbenders were probably eaten, and the bullfrogs are big enough to be a worthwhile snack. Fish were also a good protein source that could be caught from the creek and the wetland with lines or nets, but most of the identified specimens came from small individuals. Of course, shellfish also may have contributed more than we can tell if the shells themselves were disposed of at the river instead of close to site. I've talked about this before, but despite their low caloric value, mussels are rich in nutrients like vitamin A, calcium, and iron, which are vital for pregnant women and children. The snails were the big surprise. Seeing entire pit features full of freshwater snails was unexpected, but they do appear to have been regularly used as a food resource. However, all of the freshwater snail shells recovered only account for about 5 pounds of meat. Taking a step back, if we look at this from a behavioral ecology perspective, the emphasis on high labor, low return resources to supplement the deer and turkey as staples is surprising. And the fact that people of William Spring were going so far as to break open deer toes for marrow suggests a certain degree of dietary stress. Tom suggests that this is most likely to occur during the winter when plants and terrestrial animals are leaner and more scarce. That raises an important question. Was this place a continuously occupied, full village all year long, or was it a place where people aggregated during some seasons and left with a smaller resident population in others? The zooarchaeology can give us some answers to that question. Some animals, like migratory birds, are only present in northern Alabama for certain months out of the year. Some animals are born in very narrow windows of time every year, and we can estimate their age at death, allowing us to calculate the season when they died. Birds like turkeys lay eggs in particular times of year, so their presence on site indicates human activity during that season. Here's a table of those seasonality indicators with the month ranges for each filled in. Our cold-blooded and invertebrate critters are best associated with the spring through the mid-fall, so not super specific, but give us a general impression of warmer month occupation. Spawning fishes that were identified point to a spring, early summer occupation. We have a very narrow window for the availability of turkey eggs that matches with the existence of perinatal deer, which are either late fetal stage or newborns. The pin-tailed duck and passenger pigeon are species only present in the southeast during the winter months. Both head back north in the spring. And because all deer are born in May and June, a 6 to 7 month old deer must have been killed around November or December. The same goes for the fully developed deer antler still attached to the skull fragment. That specimen was killed just before it would have dropped its antlers. So in total, we see a clear and specific set of indicators for every season other than dead in the middle of summer, the July, August, September kind of range. And even those months are partially covered by the cold-blooded critters found in the assemblage, the turtles and so on. So it does look like this place was occupied at least for most of the calendar year. The next section of the analysis deals with culturally modified bone. That's a big umbrella category that includes manufactured tools, ornaments, items with polish from repeated use, so on. And it includes antlers, shell, and teeth, as well as bone proper. In total, there were 67 identified artifacts in this category, and of those, 21 were bone pins and needles like these. We also recovered unfinished pieces in the early stages of manufacture. These are metatarsal fragments, etched with scoring grooves to facilitate splitting of the bone, and then were flaked to prepare them for later carving and grinding. Another cool piece is this deer humerus scraper. I've seen these from other collections. They removed the proximal articular surface, and there tends to be a very shiny polish on this surface here, probably from scraping and scooping fat off of hides. When I was early in grad school, one of the other students had several of these, and apparently Madeline Nieberg back in the day thought that they were handheld oil lamps, where fat was packed into the medullary cavity, and a fiber wick would be inserted to use sort of like a fat candle. But there was never any burning around the mouth, and the polish from scraping was still present, so I still think that these are much more likely to be scraping tools than fat candles. Tom also identified a shell bead made from a Marginella shell, which is a tropical sea snail, which had to be imported from the coast, either the Atlantic or the Gulf. There were a couple of ground and scraped turtle shells, which is common for box turtle bowls. Bird bones like those from wild turkeys were mostly used for piercing tools like leatherworking awls. There were a couple of enigmatic polish pieces that we have pictures of in the report. The first is this rectangular piece of proximal deer tibia that was sawn off at the bottom and ground into shape at the top and around the sides. The other is part of the coronoid process from a canid mandible. Sometimes carnivore mandibles were perforated and worn as paraphernalia by ritual specialists, but we don't really know what this particular one was. The last major part of this report is the intra-site analysis and the inter-site analysis. So intra-site analyses are like comparing your kitchen and your bathroom to see how the different spaces in the same house were used differently, while the inter-site analysis would be comparing your whole house to the house down the street. They're looking at two separate sites in relationship to each other. So for the intra-site analysis, there are three main excavation areas on site. Blocks I through K in the northwest, blocks A through E in the southeast, and block H in the northeast, which doesn't get a lot of attention because there's not much there. These groupings can be used to look for different spatial patterns and look for differences in how the site was used. A basic way to do this is to look at each taxon as a percentage of its respective excavation block. So in this case, the northwest versus the southeast blocks. So for instance, garfish account for about 16% of the fish specimens in the northwestern block, but only 3% of the fish from the southeast. Bass and sunfish are poorly represented in the northwest, and drum are overrepresented in the southeast. Musk turtles account for about 14% of the reptiles in the southeast, but only about 5% of the reptiles in the northeast. Birds don't show any super glaring differences in distribution, but we can see the species diversity for mammals in the Northeast is a bit higher and more even than in the Southeast. So, less deer, more rabbits, squirrels, dogs, things like that. Speaking of the dogs, while concentrations of dog remains were found in features 111, 283, 304 in the southeast, and 606 in the northwest area, they were all disarticulated and interspersed with other animal remains. They weren't articulated skeletons from a burial. This contrasts strongly with feature 609, which contained a complete dog skeleton where the bones were in anatomically correct position. This is the only instance of dog remains where we can tell it was treated as a reverent burial and not like generalized surface refuse. That doesn't necessarily mean that those other dogs were consumed as food, but their remains weren't found in a deliberate burial context. As for inter-site analysis, Tom compiled data from Site 1MA308, which is nearby Williams Spring but closer to the river, Widows Creek, and Spirit Hill in Jackson County, Alabama. We also have the Middle Woodland Owl Hollow sites from the Normandy Dam projects on the Duck River in Tennessee. Unfortunately, 1MA308 was not analyzed in its totality. Only about 2,000 specimens were analyzed as a representative sample, and none of the snails were identified, even though over 750 shells were counted from the random sample we have. The most obvious difference is that birds and fishes are completely absent from 308. It also has a greater abundance of large mussel shell and larger turtle species, which is probably because 308 is directly on the Tennessee River, where these resources are immediately available. Widows Creek was also contemporary with Williams Spring, and the vertebrate fauna from these sites are very similar. However, there are some differences. Widows Creek is also on the bank of the Tennessee River, and it contained much bigger riverine fishes, like sturgeon and larger catfish. And turtles are more abundant as well. Bone tools also differ between the sites. The bone needles common at Williams Spring are absent at Widows Creek, and Widows Creek has bone fish hooks that Williams Spring lacks. Also in Jackson County, the Spirit Hill site was a totally different critter. They found 25 articulated dog burials, and that accounted for most of the identified material. The fact that they found 25 complete dogs skews the percentages when comparing the individual scattered parts of other animals like deer and turkey. If you remove the dog remains from the equation, the assemblage looks much more similar to the Williams Spring. As an aside, I have a couple of colleagues who worked on Spirit Hill, and they always spoke highly of the experience. Their names are Country Bob and Karen Mayo. If you ever run into them at a conference, be sure to ask them about it. The Owl Hollow sites on the Elk and Duck River were described as having more foraging and trapping associated taxa rather than big hunting taxa like deer and turkeys. The large mammal bones that were recovered tended to be highly fragmented for bone grease, just like at Williams Spring. This kind of resource maximization behavior, combined with the focus on very labor-intensive, low-calorie foods like snails, suggests that there was at least some seasonal dietary stress along the Tennessee River Valley. So that's the story that the animal bones tell us about the Williams Spring site. It was a village that was occupied pretty much all year long. People relied primarily on deer and turkeys and raccoons and squirrels and fish, and surprisingly, freshwater snails in some cases for the meat diet. They practiced an abnormally diligent, low-waste food practice that involved the breaking open and breaking down of bone elements to be boiled out for excess within bone nutrients, grease and collagen and things like that. This is especially industrious considering this is a hardwood environment where there are plenty of oak and hickory and other nut trees that produce a lot of fat. I'll talk more about the plant remains that we recovered and what we can say using those in the next video. But, and I'll try to integrate that with the Zooarch and make more of a broad food ways oriented discussion at the end of that one. once we've covered both. Again, I've got several videos on the channel that deal with zooarchaeology and human behavioral ecology and these kinds of questions that I think will help to clarify and contextualize a lot about this video. So if you want to check those out, I will put those links to those down in the video description. If you have any questions after reviewing that, feel free to drop a comment below. Or before reviewing that, feel free to drop a comment below. I always look forward to reading those. And as always, thank you for watching.